that some promises and some things are for Israel. And God is not done with Israel, and he's going to work again in Israel, as we've kind of talked about the last couple of weeks, in the last 7 years, that 70th week of Daniel, and depending on your eschatology. So if God says to Israel, I'm going to give you this land, and I'll give you an example. I remember talking to a gentleman one time. We're talking about the church, and we have a sign over there that says, hey, if you're not staff or you're not one of the volunteers for the kids ministry, don't go in there. Right? That's what our sign says. And I'm not saying this, well, anyway. So he makes the point, and he says, God has promised that wherever we put our foot, that land belongs to us. And you're like, besides the fact that's completely impractical for the modern day, that was to Israel. Right? So if I read today as a Christian, is God telling me I can fly over to the, if I were to mark out the dimensions of the promised land, and I can just start walking around over there, and it's mine? No. But that was the promise to Israel, right? Coming out of Egypt, the promise was, anywhere you put your foot, I'll give you that land. Because that was their land to get. Now, we might want to spiritualize that and to go, well, you know what? In the battle for my soul, anywhere I put my foot, that means that you know what, God's going to give me victory. Okay, cool. But there's other New Testament promises for that. And that might remind you of that, but that's not what it says. And that's not what the promise is. So we have to be careful when we're reading promises, when we're reading Old Testament, Old Covenant things, that we don't grab it. Otherwise, you end up with really weird eschatology, like replacement theology. Right? Have you heard? Replacement theology is that the church is the new Israel. And so all the promises to Israel are now spiritualized, and they're given to the church. And so then you go back in and you read all these things. But the problem is, if you take it that way, God says that the promises are inseparable from the curses. Because you have all the curses from disobedience that were from Israel. So you start getting some really weird ideas about that. Or if you say, well, you know what, we keep the dietary laws and we keep the Sabbath. That's it, and because that shows that we're serious about loving God. Well, then why does Paul say it's obsolete and it's the ministry of death? Why would we want to go back to something that Paul calls the ministry of death to try to show spirituality? Because that was for a time, and it was for a certain people. So we can read the Old Testament, we glean from the Old Testament, and there's much more to be said about it. But when it's something that's clearly a promise to Israel, then it's a promise to Israel. There's even promises to Egypt in the Old Testament. There's promises to Assyria in the Old Testament. You start reading Isaiah 19 and 20. It talks about, I'm going to bring Assyria. I'm going to bring Egypt. They're all going to walk together. There's going to be peace. There's going to be... Well, clearly that's a future thing, right? Because that's not happening right now. So there are promises for people besides Israel in the Old Testament, but we have to be careful with that. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Any questions about that? Because this is really important, or else we end up with very weird theology very fast.